Hey friends, you're watching BrainStormAcres. I'm Henry.
And I'm Irene.
Today we're going to talk about cooties.
Cooties!
Yeah, cooties. Well, we're going to talk about two different kinds of cooties today. First, we have to say, what we tell you today is our information. The best thing you can do to avoid getting foodborne illness is to follow the guidelines produced by the FDA. You can find them in the Ball Blue Book. You can find them in the CDC. You can find them in the FDA. So although we know an awful lot about food safety and food canning, don't just take our word for it. Do your own research. So let's talk about botulism first. Everybody's really afraid of botulism.
Well, for good reason. It's a neurotoxin. And in the past, it has killed people.
There's about 185, I think, last year, something like that.
Right.
But you know, when Irene's talking about botulism, an awful lot of the fear about canning at home comes from 100 years ago, and more than 100 years ago, because there were problems when people were canning before they really knew how to kill off the cooties.
Well, it was the professional companies that were doing a lot of the poisoning, actually. They would do a batch of canned goods, and they wouldn't achieve the proper temperatures and stuff. And then the cans would start to swell and fun things like that. If you run across a swollen can, unless it's post-apocalypse, maybe even if it's a post-apocalypse, just throw it away. You know, they frequently will sell cans at the grocery store that are past their best of use by date, or that are dented and stuff like that. And as long as they're not leaking, if the old cans used to have a free lid at both ends, so it was basically a column of metal with a lid on top and a lid on the bottom, and the edges were crimped, both top and bottom. Most of the new cans today are actually a pressed form, so it's a cup basically, and then they put a lid on. If the bottom of that is dented,
no big deal.
I don't worry about it because there's no seal down there anymore. But if a sealed edge is dented, I generally avoid it because it just might not have the integrity that you want it to have. And if that sits on the back shelf somewhere, you may not notice it's leaked or something like that, and then you get yourself in trouble. The problem with botulism is it's very easily controlled. But if you read what the CDC says about it, remember we talked about how you control cooties? You control them with heat, you control them with acid, with sugar, with salt, and then there's that magical thing we're going to talk about eventually, which is water activity. And what the CDC says is the environments that are perfect for growing botulism is low oxygen, basically what they call anaerobic activity, or no oxygen, low acid, low sugar,
low
salt, certain temperature range, and a certain amount of water. So just follow the rules. Botulism is present in the environment everywhere.
And the bad thing about botulism is that when the organism decides to pull its horns in and go to sleep for a while,
it's a spore. It just sits there, and there are spores on just about every surface. It's everywhere. You know, you can be the cleanest housewife in the world; it doesn't make any difference.
or the house husband.
It's everywhere. It's just part of nature. But there's certain circumstances under which it can become a problem.
Botulism is something that, you need to be concerned about, but you don't need to be afraid of.
Right.
The whole trick here is when you're canning, make sure that you follow the instructions in the Ball Blue Book or other competent source.
Right. This is a case where some of the crazy stuff that I see some of the homesteaders on TV doing, I'm just like, no, that's just not safe. It may taste good. They may have been lucky, but I want to be able to leave a jar of canned items on the shelf I want to be able to find it 4 years later accidentally and know whether it's safe or not. And if I've done what I'm supposed to do and it's maintained its seal, it should be safe. It may be mushy, but it's not going to kill me.
So the big thing is follow the instructions. Don't go off and go in the weeds and try to do some new low temperature thing. The real problem with canning at home is unless you really know what you're doing, you don't want to go outside of the guidelines.
Right. Henry mentioned the new low temperature thing. There is a new low temperature approved canning technique, but it requires being able to control the water temperature within 5 degrees and keeping it within that 5 degrees for like 30 minutes.
Canning at home is not something to be afraid of. It is something to follow the instructions on. It's simple, follow them, don't deviate, and life will be fine.
Right.
We'll tell you why it will be fine later on in a future installment.
Right.
Now, there are some topics that we're going to talk about that I know for sure are going to upset a bunch of homesteaders.
Oh, well, it's like I said, some of the homesteaders out there are doing what they call off-schedule canning. You are allowed to do what the heck you want to do in your own home. Most people I know who are trying to can at home want to produce a safe product. Just because your friend or your neighbor or your grandma did it this way and it came out okay, if it's really off schedule, can you guarantee that everything has the exact circumstances that other person has? I doubt that. That's hard enough to do in a lab setting, much less to do from household to household. So you just have to decide. You have to make those decisions for yourself. But especially if you're a beginner, just start by following the rules. It's like, okay, we're working on improving our zucchini bread recipe. The first time through, I followed that recipe to the dime. The next time you make it, you go, okay, it needed a little bit more of this. Needed a little bit less of that. And you fiddle with it each time and you make a note of what you did each time. But you start by making it, quote unquote, the right way. You make it the way they told you to. And then you can go off and do crazy things if you want to. But you can always come back to, if you have a total failed bread and it's flat and it's squishy, then you can always go back to the original and say, boy, I screwed that one up. But that's an obvious thing. That's not something that's going to sneak up on you. If your bread is squishy and yucky, it'll be super obvious the minute you make it. A canned item is not always super obvious. Now, I'm not telling people to not collect their own honey. I'm just telling them not to feed it to their 18-month-old grandchild if it's not pasteurized.
It's pretty simple.
That's simple.
You know, there's a lot of things on the homestead that you have to make decisions for yourself on. You know, we're not going to tell you don't drink raw milk. We've had raw milk.
Oh, God, I love good raw milk.
We're not going to tell you to not eat uncured cheese. Some uncured cheese is awesome.
We make cheese. We bought the raw milk before to make raw cheese.
But you know, when you look at botulism, in 2017 there were 183 cases reported in the U.S. Of those, 19 were food related. All of the others were from wounds. You got a cut, you broke an arm and you got dirt in it. You have a compound fracture of your arm and you got dirt in it. Only 19 of them were from food illness.
Right. Well, you know, most of the United States sanitation is more than adequate to, I mean, you might get sick, but you're not going to get botulism.
Yeah. Now, there have been some outbreaks of botulism from home canning. There was a famous one, I think, about 20 years ago in Oregon, when a Mexican restaurant used some home-canned jalapenos that hadn't been canned right, and they had a bunch of people get sick. That's not the usual case.
No.
So don't be overly concerned about it. Do follow the instructions. Not a big deal.
Well, and in fairness, today, assuming you get medical care and just don't put a poultice on it, you know, when you get sick, they can usually provide you with the medical support today to save you. Back at the turn of the century, that's the 1900s, not the
Not the 2000s.
not the 2000s. There were instances where people died because they didn't have the medical care. They didn't have the respirators and the other things like that to keep somebody on, because it's a neurotoxin, so it can actually cause you to stop being able to breathe. And we have respirators now that can breathe for you. Obviously, you don't want to do that, but they can usually save you.
Well, let's go on to something that probably every one of you watching this show has heard about, and that is salmonella. Mm-hmm. Salmonella outbreaks. That's by far the most common form of food poisoning that we're talking about today. Remember, we're only talking about 2 specific organisms. Mm-hmm. Now, salmonella, where do you get it? Well, poultry is one place.
Right.
And that's probably the biggest place. But how do you get it in greens? How do you get it in peaches? Right now, there's a big peach recall going on because of salmonella.
I even missed that one.
There's about 1.3 million cases of salmonella reported in the U.S. every single year. 1.3 million. The reason why people don't die very often from salmonella is because the CDC will require or suggest recalls, and most food manufacturers are good about recalling.
Because they don't want to be sued because they killed somebody.
So this is where things get interesting for homesteaders, because if you're concerned about salmonella, don't eat cracked eggs. Don't eat eggs that have gray spots on them. You can get salmonella in eggs because the salmonella can be in the egg before the shell is formed.
Right.
So
it's a matter of having the chicken flock be infected. They had an outbreak this year in Great Britain. In Great Britain, they are required to guarantee that their flocks are salmonella free. We don't have that requirement in the United States.
So it's really simple. In order to control most food-borne pathogens, that is, most food-borne illnesses, wash your hands. Mm-hmm. That's the number one.
Oh, there's a whole stack of salmonella outbreaks in the United States in children from having pet chickens.
Or reptiles.
Yeah.
So there are ways of getting salmonella that are perfectly ordinary, mm-hmm. but wash your hands, wash your work surface. If you're cutting up raw chicken, keep your utensils and your cutting board segregated, so don't have cross-contamination.
Right. When I do stir fry and I'm using raw chicken, I cut all the veggies first, get them off to the side, then use the cutting board for chicken, then wash the cutting board, the knife, and my hands, and I use a brush under my nails because I'm handling it, and you get that goop under your nails.
The last thing you can do is you can use a Clorox wad or a Clorox wipe mm-hmm. to wipe work surfaces, which is what we would suggest. When you've watched our cooking videos, you see that we always make sure that our entire work surface is clean. It may be crowded with other stuff, but it's clean. Well, I hope this is of interest to you. I hope you found it interesting. I hope that it helps you in your canning process and your canning adventures. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Say goodnight, Irene.
Good night, Irene.
You're not going to sing?
No.
We'll talk with you later.
Bye.
I just lost my train of thought.
Brain fart.
It got derailed.
Fell off the tracks.